Pilot belittles black woman's seat. Choice minutes later, she grounds his career forever. Sometimes, a single encounter aboard an ordinary commercial flight can reshape destinies. On a bustling morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, an accomplished black woman named Danielle steps onto a plane, eager for her routine trip to Seattle. Little does she know, her quiet journey will collide with a pilot's prejudice, igniting a chain of events that will leave everyone breathless. When Captain Richard Belmore belittles Danielle for choosing a seat that he claims isn't meant for her, he has no clue who he's just insulted or the power she wields to ground his flight, his future, and his entire career forever. Danielle Howard clutched her sleek leather laptop bag as she navigated the crowded corridors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. It was 7:00 a.m., and the morning rush was in full swing. The bright overhead lights reflected off polished floors, and the air hummed with the cacophony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and travelers hurrying to their gates. Danielle's sophisticated yet understated attire, dark slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a fitted blazer made it clear she was all business. Still, her eyes sparkled with anticipation. Despite having traversed through countless airports, she never ceased to find a slight thrill in the promise of a new journey. She stopped briefly at a kiosk to double-check her gate information on the display screens. Her flight to Seattle on Delta Airlines was leaving from Gate 23. She had about an hour until boarding, so she decided to grab a quick cup of coffee, passing by anxious families, bored-looking business travelers, and excited backpackers. Danielle felt that familiar swirl of human stories all around her, each person on their own path, yet all converging within these walls of departure and arrival. At the coffee shop, she picked up a plain black coffee, no sugar, no cream. An elderly couple behind her in line recognized her from an aviation symposium a few months ago. They offered her a polite nod, but she simply smiled, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Danielle was proud of her position. She was not only an aeronautical engineer, but also a Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) consultant with specialized knowledge in aircraft safety. She was also known, when circumstances demanded it, for her no-nonsense attitude toward negligence. Although she generally preferred keeping her achievements under wraps, her name occasionally popped up in the industry, especially when she uncovered major safety oversights. She made her way to Gate 23, sipped her coffee, and set up her laptop to answer a few last-minute work emails. Next to her was a young woman wearing headphones and a college sweatshirt, rummaging through her backpack for her boarding pass. On Danielle's other side, an older gentleman clutched a cane and gazed at planes through the massive glass windows. As boarding time approached, the gate agent's voice crackled through the speaker. Now boarding all first-class passengers for Delta Flight 4722 to Seattle. Danielle stood up, smoothing her blazer, and grabbed her bag. She stepped into the boarding line, flanked by an assortment of well-dressed professionals, some influencers streaming on their phones, and others simply eager to settle in for the long flight. Danielle's seat was 2A in first class, a benefit she treated herself to now and then due to her frequent travel. She typically flew so often that the extra comfort was almost a necessity, not just a luxury. As she approached her seat, a flight attendant greeted her warmly and offered to stow her carry-on overhead. Danielle thanked her and settled into her window seat. She noticed a few curious glances as she slid into 2A. It was not uncommon. Occasionally people seemed surprised to see a young, black professional woman seated in first class, alone. She had learned to ignore such stares over the years, wearing her composure like a shield against subtle prejudices. Within minutes, passengers in the main cabin began to shuffle in. Murmurs of conversation filled the cabin, overhead bins clicked, seat belts were adjusted, and attendants wove through the aisles offering assistance. Danielle opened her laptop to review a few notes on her latest FAA project. She was working on a comprehensive audit aimed at streamlining safety protocols for short-haul flights. Her real passion was bridging the gap between advanced engineering and everyday airline operations, ensuring that the technologies airlines used were thoroughly tested, verified, and responsibly implemented. She didn't look up until she heard the flight attendant say, "Welcome aboard, Captain Belmore," in a cheerful voice. Danielle saw the pilot from the corner of her eye. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, wearing the signature Delta pilot's uniform. His hair, peppered with grey, suggested many years of flying experience. He nodded curtly at the flight attendant and stepped into the cockpit. Usually, pilots arrived before the passengers, but apparently Captain Richard Belmore had a tight schedule today, or maybe there had been a shift change. Danielle wouldn't have given it a second thought if not for what happened next. The pilot emerged from the cockpit just as passengers were still filtering in. He walked down the first-class aisle, scanning seats, as if double-checking something. When his gaze fell upon Danielle, there was a fleeting look of surprise. Or was it distaste? She couldn't tell in that split second. She shrugged it off as pre-flight stress. Just as Danielle resumed reading her documents, a quiet hush fell over the nearby rows. She glanced up to see the pilot standing right in front of her seat, arms folded. "Excuse me," he said in a clipped tone. "May I see your boarding pass?" Danielle felt a prickle of discomfort. She blinked once, then politely replied, "I already showed my boarding pass to the flight attendant, but sure." She retrieved the slip of paper from the front pocket of her blazer. The pilot snatched the boarding pass more brusquely than necessary. He studied it with narrowed eyes, as if expecting to find some discrepancy. After a few seconds, he handed it back and spoke in a lower voice that only Danielle and possibly a couple of passengers nearby could hear. "You're in first class. On a business trip, are you?" Danielle's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yes," she replied, her voice measured. "Is that a problem?" He gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No problem. Just making sure passengers are seated correctly. You'd be surprised how many people try to upgrade themselves at the last minute. That's why the boarding passes are scanned," Danielle pointed out calmly. The pilot let out a barely audible scoff. "Indeed. Well, enjoy your flight." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the cockpit. It was a subtle exchange, yet the tension was tangible. Danielle heard a soft tsk from a middle-aged woman in the aisle seat across from her, who caught the exchange. Another passenger, a young Asian man seated behind Danielle, stared at his phone intently, as if to avoid intruding on the awkward moment. Danielle felt her chest tighten, but she was determined to keep her composure. She'd experienced countless microaggressions before. She didn't need to blow up over every single one. After all, it might have been a routine seat check. Still, something about the pilot's tone and demeanor rang alarm bells. The flight attendants closed the main cabin door, and the usual safety announcements played. Danielle kept her eyes fixed on her laptop, trying to finalize a small detail in her report. She was deep in thought when she felt a shift in the plane's movement as they taxied onto the runway. Takeoff was smooth. Soon, the plane soared into the sky, Chicago's skyline fading beneath a canopy of clouds. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and a flight attendant passed through the first-class cabin, offering drinks and light snacks. Danielle accepted a glass of orange juice, feeling her nerves settle as the familiarity of flight took hold. She was about to resume work when the intercom crackled. Captain Belmore's voice came through, greeting passengers. His standard speech about expected weather conditions and flight time ended with a curious note. "And we kindly remind passengers to remain in their assigned seats. We appreciate your cooperation in keeping this flight orderly." There was an odd emphasis on that last sentence. A few first-class passengers exchanged puzzled glances. Danielle sensed a distinct vibe that the pilot's announcement was targeted, yet another subtle jibe. She gripped the armrest, recalling how she'd seen him single her out. Still, she willed herself to remain calm. She had dealt with worse in her professional life. Some men had been threatened by her expertise. Some doubted her credentials until she spoke technical jargon that only a seasoned engineer would know. But there was a stark difference in dealing with colleagues in a conference room and being stuck on a plane, thousands of feet in the air, under the authority of a pilot who seemed to have singled her out. By this time, the flight attendant was back in the aisle. Spotting Danielle's furrowed brow, she leaned over and asked quietly, "Everything okay, Miss Howard? Can I get you anything else?" Danielle forced a small smile. "No, I'm all right. Thank you for checking." The attendant smiled sympathetically before moving on to the next row. The rest of the cabin seemed unaware of the friction. Some were dozing off, while others scrolled through their in-flight entertainment or typed away on laptops. An hour into the flight, Danielle stood up to stretch her legs and use the restroom. On her way down the aisle, she noticed Captain Belmore stepping out of the cockpit. He walked toward the galley but paused when he saw her. His gaze flicked to her seat and then to her face. "Everything all right, miss?" he began. Danielle offered a clipped nod. "Howard, yes, everything is fine. Just stretching my legs." He raised an eyebrow. "Hope you're enjoying the seat you're entitled to," he said, the words dripping with something akin to sarcasm. She froze, searching his face to see if she'd misheard. But no, the condescension was stark. Another passenger at the front row of economy clearly overheard and frowned, glancing between them. Danielle took a steadying breath. "I don't think that's a particularly polite question." The pilot's mouth twitched. "Pardon me if I came across as impolite. I merely like to ensure all passengers are comfortable, especially those up front." Danielle crossed her arms. "I'm quite comfortable. I paid for my seat just like everyone else in first class." A tense moment passed. The pilot's eyes flicked to the silver FAA pin on her blazer's lapel, something she often wore, though rarely drew attention to. His expression grew guarded. Without another word, he turned and walked away, the tension in his shoulders visible. For a few moments, Danielle stood there, her heart pounding with frustration. Why was he targeting her? Racial bias? A personal grudge? She returned to her seat and decided to take a few deep breaths before confronting him further. After all, she had to get to Seattle safely. She'd figure out the rest on the ground if needed. The flight continued for another half hour in relative quiet. Danielle tried to refocus on her work, but her mind was a whirlwind of questions and indignation. She clicked through her email drafts, rereading them without really absorbing any content. Then something happened that jolted her out of her thoughts. A faint but distinct mechanical whir, followed by a vibration under her feet. She knew planes often made various noises mid-flight, but this felt different. She'd spent enough hours in simulators and on real flights to distinguish typical cabin whirs from mechanical abnormalities. She removed her headphones and leaned to the side. Through the window, she couldn't see any obvious issue with the engines. Still, the plane seemed to quiver for a moment. Looking around, she noticed a few other passengers seemed momentarily discomforted, while others carried on sleeping or reading. A flight attendant walked by, and Danielle lightly tapped her arm. "Did you feel that tremor?" The attendant pursed her lips. "We had some mild turbulence, but it looks like we're past it now. Nothing to worry about." Danielle nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Her background in aeronautical engineering made her sensitive to anomalies. She listened for more sounds, but heard nothing out of the ordinary. 5 minutes later, the seatbelt sign flashed on, and Captain Belmore's voice announced, "We're expecting some mild turbulence for the next few minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Danielle glanced out the window. The sky looked calm, no storm clouds in sight. She wondered if this was just a standard precaution or something else. Her curiosity simmered into discomfort as she realized that if there was a genuine mechanical concern, the pilot's attitude might lead him to ignore or downplay it. She tried to think rationally. Pilots were professionals, trained to handle emergencies. Even if Captain Belmore had personal biases, he wouldn't endanger the entire flight. Or would he? The uneasy flight rumbled on. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, Danielle decided to speak to a flight attendant more directly. She signaled for the lead flight attendant, a composed woman named Sandra, who had a reassuring air of experience about her. "Can I help you, Miss Howard?" Sandra asked, leaning in so the conversation remained private. "I heard some unusual noises a while ago. I have an engineering background, and something felt off," Danielle began. "Could you check with the cockpit if everything's okay? I just have a sense that we should be cautious." Sandra paused, then nodded gently. "Of course. I'll go speak to Captain Belmore." A few minutes later, Sandra returned, wearing a polite but tight smile. "Captain Belmore says everything is under control. There's some mild turbulence expected around the Rockies, but it's nothing to worry about." "Did you mention I'm an FAA consultant?" Danielle asked, her tone carefully even. "I did," Sandra replied, her smile dimming. "He insisted everything is fine and asked me to remind you to remain seated if turbulence returns." Danielle exhaled slowly. She knew there wasn't much she could do in midair besides trust the flight crew. She thanked Sandra and tried to calm her churning thoughts. Just then, a passenger from the middle of the first-class cabin, a tall man in a well-tailored suit, spoke up. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Danielle. "I couldn't help but overhear you're in aeronautics. I felt that vibration too. Should we be worried?" Several other passengers turned their heads. Danielle offered a small, reassuring smile. "I don't want to alarm anyone. It's probably just mild turbulence or a normal mechanical shift. The pilot says everything is under control." The man still looked uneasy, but he nodded and turned back to his seat. Others who had overheard likewise tried to settle back into their flight routine. Another half-hour passed. Danielle decided she'd try to speak directly to the captain once more, albeit in a respectful way. She unbuckled her seatbelt and moved discreetly toward the cockpit area. A flight attendant intercepted her gently. "Miss Howard, the captain has asked that passengers not approach the cockpit." Danielle gave a polite nod, but stood firm. "This is a matter of safety. I'll be brief. Can you at least let him know I'm here and would like to have a quick word?" The flight attendant sighed, then relayed the message through the interphone. Moments later, Captain Belmore stepped out, visibly irritated. "Yes?" he asked, glancing at Danielle. She drew in a steadying breath. "Captain, I apologize for bothering you, but as an FAA consultant and an aeronautical engineer, I wanted to offer assistance if there's any mechanical concern. I noticed a vibration earlier." His jaw tightened. "I'd been flying planes long before you got your engineering degree, Miss Howard. I appreciate your concern, but we have procedures, and I'll thank you to trust the crew's assessment." Danielle looked him in the eye. "I do trust standard procedures, but your earlier remarks about my seat choice make me wonder if you're not taking my observations seriously." He laughed short, mirthless. "Now you're questioning my professionalism. You don't have to worry. I know exactly who you are, Miss FAA consultant. I saw your name on the passenger manifest. Don't think your affiliation entitles you to run my cockpit. Go back to your seat." A wave of indignation coursed through Danielle, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm not trying to run your cockpit, Captain. I'm asking you to remain open to the possibility that there might be an issue we should address. Lives are at stake." His face hardened. You think I'd risk the safety of everyone on board because I don't like you? That's what you're implying, isn't it? Danielle opened her mouth to reply, but he cut her off. Enough. Return to your seat. If you have any further concerns, you can file a report with the airline or the FAA after we land if you really think there's a case. But for now, let me do my job. He turned on his heel and stalked back into the cockpit. The flight attendant from earlier gently ushered Danielle back. She took her seat, fuming but determined not to let the situation escalate into a shouting match at 35,000 feet. For now, she had to play it smart. The next hour was tense for Danielle. She tried to distract herself by reading a book on her e-reader, but her mind kept drifting to the pilot's words. She had never encountered such open hostility from a pilot before. It was more than an isolated microaggression. It felt like the pilot had singled her out from the start, as though he'd decided she didn't belong in first class and resented her questioning him. Adding to her anxiety, the plane encountered genuine turbulence over the Rocky Mountains. Passengers clung to their armrests, some letting out nervous laughs or curses. The overhead bins rattled. The flight attendants took their seats, strapping in quickly. The seatbelt sign flashed on again, and Captain Belmore's voice crackled over the speakers with a simple directive: "Everyone please remain in your seats and fasten your belts." Through it all, Danielle caught the pilot's occasional announcements. He sounded terse, lacking the usual reassuring tone. While the turbulence wasn't the worst Danielle had ever experienced, it was enough to jostle the plane pretty hard for a good 20 minutes. Eventually, the shaking eased and the flight attendants resumed their duties. Passengers sighed in relief. A middle-aged woman in a floral blouse across the aisle asked, "How often does this happen?" in a shaky voice to no one in particular. Danielle leaned over to reassure her. "It's not uncommon over mountainous terrain. We'll likely pass out of it soon." The woman managed a grateful smile, looking at Danielle's FAA pin. "Thank you. You seem to know what you're talking about." Danielle nodded gently. "I do my best." As she settled back, the plane steadied into smoother air. The remainder of the flight was uneventful, at least in terms of turbulence. However, unbeknownst to Danielle, a chain of events was about to unfold that would validate her suspicions. One of the flight attendants, a young man named Javier, had overheard the confrontation between Danielle and the captain. Javier was new to the airline, but took his responsibilities seriously. Despite his inexperience, he had enough knowledge to notice when something felt off, both with the aircraft and the pilot's demeanor. Curiosity piqued, Javier discreetly checked some cabin systems. He noticed one slight anomaly in the power distribution readings for cabin lighting. It was minor, barely noticeable, except to someone paying close attention. Although a minor power fluctuation in the cabin lights didn't necessarily mean anything major, it could sometimes point to deeper electrical issues. Javier decided to mention it to the co-pilot, First Officer Amanda Klein, during a routine pass at the cockpit. He knocked softly on the cockpit door, and after a moment, Amanda let him in. Captain Belmore was busy communicating with air traffic control. "MAAM, Javier said quietly, "I just wanted to mention something about a small fluctuation in the cabin lighting monitors. It's probably nothing, but I'd like to record it in the flight log." Amanda, who appeared calm and professional, nodded. "All right, thanks for letting me know. I'll take a look at the electrical bus readings." She glanced at Captain Belmore, who was still on the radio. "Let's keep it between us for the moment. If it's serious, we'll let the captain know." Javier felt a wave of relief that Amanda took him seriously. He slipped out and returned to the galley, trying to remain inconspicuous. About half an hour before they were due to land, Amanda quietly alerted the captain to the electrical anomaly. According to her checks, a small fluctuation in an auxiliary power bus was indeed occurring intermittently. While not immediately dangerous, it warranted caution. Captain Belmore, feeling cornered, especially after Danielle's earlier confrontation, brushed it off. "Everything's within operational limits," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll note it in the logs and have maintenance check it after we land." Amanda bit her lip. She was aware of the tension between the pilot and the passenger in 2A word had spread through the flight crew. She suspected that tension might cloud his judgment. "Sir, I just want to be sure we're not ignoring a symptom of a bigger issue." He gave her a long, withering stare. "I said it's within limits. We'll proceed to land as planned. End of discussion." Amanda recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and decided not to push it yet. As the plane made its descent into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Danielle felt the usual ear-popping and slight lurch of altitude change. The pilot came on the pass system, instructing passengers to return trays and seats to their upright positions. The approach was smooth, and soon the aircraft touched down on the runway. A wave of relief spread among passengers, grateful to be safely on the ground after the turbulence. Danielle let out a silent exhale, feeling the typical mild euphoria of a completed flight. The plane taxied to the gate. Danielle began packing her laptop, slipping it into her bag. Out the window, she could see the bustle of ground crew directing the aircraft. The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers stood, retrieving belongings from overhead bins. Danielle had no intention of confronting Captain Belmore now. She planned to simply exit the plane, then file a detailed report with the airline and possibly with the FAA. If her concerns about his conduct and the potential electrical issue proved warranted. However, fate had other plans. As the door to the jet bridge opened, Danielle stood in the aisle, waiting her turn to disembark. She overheard one flight attendant telling another in a hushed tone, "Maintenance is here to check something with the power bus." "Captain's not happy." Her ears perked up at that. She stepped forward, heart pounding, as she realized that she might have been right. There was, in fact, a mechanical issue that demanded immediate attention. Danielle emerged into the jet bridge, feeling the climate-controlled air of the airport on her face. She looked around to see Captain Belmore standing near the cockpit door, speaking in low tones to a maintenance worker. His posture was defensive, arms crossed, brow furrowed. She approached quietly, mindful of not intruding, but the maintenance worker recognized her from her FAA pin and nodded politely. "Miss Howard, right? I've seen you at a conference before." Captain Belmore whirled around at the mention of her name. "You again," he hissed, frustration saturating his voice. "I suppose you're going to run to your superiors now and tell them we almost crashed or something ridiculous like that." Danielle took a steady breath. "I'll tell them the truth, Captain. I've encountered a situation where a potential electrical issue might have been overlooked. And yes, your behavior throughout this flight has been unprofessional at best, discriminatory at worst." His eyes flared with anger. "Who do you think you are? You don't run this airline. This is my cockpit, my responsibility. I've logged over 10,000 flight hours without incident." "And I respect that," Danielle said evenly, "but experience doesn't excuse ignoring genuine safety concerns." A cluster of curious passengers had started to gather at the edge of the jet bridge, noticing the tension. Flight attendants hovered nearby, uncertain whether to intervene. The maintenance worker cleared his throat. "Captain, we found repeated fluctuations in the power bus logs. We need to take the plane out of service for a thorough inspection." Captain Belmore spun toward him. "You've got to be kidding. This flight is scheduled to head back out in an hour." "That's how these routes work. Taking it out of service is an overreaction." Danielle stepped in, her voice calm yet firm. "Overreaction or not, ignoring a potential electrical malfunction could lead to catastrophic consequences. The airline's protocol and FAA regulations demand immediate inspection in cases like this." He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "You win, Miss Howard. I see how this is going to go. You show up in first class, wave your FAA badge around, and suddenly the The plane is grounded. Congratulations on meddling in business that isn't yours. Danielle felt a surge of both anger and pity. He was so blinded by his prejudice that he couldn't see she was simply doing her job. She managed to keep her voice level. "Captain, I'm sorry if you feel threatened by me, but this is the right thing to do." Just then, the ground staff supervisor arrived. Upon seeing Danielle, he recognized her instantly. She had consulted on a safety audit for the airport just last month. "Miss Howard, is everything okay here?" Captain Belmore took one look at the supervisor, then back at Danielle, realizing that she held far more influence than he'd ever imagined. His face paled. Danielle gave a succinct explanation to the supervisor. "We've identified an electrical inconsistency in the aircraft. Maintenance needs to do a thorough check. I can confirm it's not safe for immediate redeparture until they do so." The supervisor nodded, turning to the maintenance worker. "Take it to Hangar 5 for full diagnostics. I'll start reassigning the next flight's passengers to a different aircraft." He then looked at Captain Belmore. "We'll need your report as well, Captain." Fuming, Captain Belmore marched down the jet bridge, ignoring the baffled expressions from passengers. His pilot's hat sat askew on his head, symbolizing the upheaval in his carefully controlled world. Half an hour later, Danielle was in the airport lounge, sipping a new cup of coffee, trying to shake off the stress of the confrontation. One of the flight attendants, Sandra, approached, looking anxious but relieved at the same time. "Miss Howard," Sandra began, "I just wanted to thank you. That electrical issue, turns out it could have been really serious if left unchecked." Danielle nodded. "I'm glad they're addressing it. I only wish the captain had taken it more seriously from the start." Sandra bit her lip. "He has a bit of a reputation for being hard to work with, especially when he feels challenged. But I've never seen him single out a passenger like he did with you." A flicker of sadness passed through Danielle. "Unfortunately, that happens sometimes, but I'm not going to let it slide. I'm going to file a full report. This kind of behavior has no place in aviation where safety and respect are paramount." Sandra nodded firmly. "I agree. If you need any witness statements, I'd be willing to vouch for what I saw and heard. Thank you." "That means a lot," Danielle said, offering a grateful smile. Later that day, Danielle locked herself in a quiet corner of the airline's VIP lounge, opened her laptop, and began drafting her formal report. She detailed the pilot's initial confrontational attitude, his apparent disbelief about her seat assignment, and his repeated dismissive remarks regarding her concerns. She then added the technical findings about the electrical system anomaly, how the minor power bus fluctuation could have escalated into a significant in-flight issue if left unchecked. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she wrote with clarity and precision. She cited FAA regulations, airline policy guidelines, and the correct procedures for addressing any potential mechanical or electrical irregularities mid-flight. She included the times, names, and relevant details to ensure there was a factual, unassailable record of events. She concluded her report with a personal reflection, how the pilot's bias and unprofessional conduct posed a potential threat to passenger safety and staff morale. It was a strong concluding note, pointing out that while experience and skill in the cockpit are paramount, they do not excuse or outweigh prejudice, nor the refusal to act on legitimate safety concerns. By the time Danielle finished, the lounge had thinned out considerably. The day had grown late, sunlight streaming in through the large windows, painting the lounge with an orange glow. She clicked send, dispatching the report to both the airline's corporate office and her direct contact at the FAA. Over the following days, Danielle remained in Seattle, conducting her scheduled business. She had a series of meetings with Boeing engineers regarding new safety protocols. Yet, in the back of her mind, she kept thinking about the flight with Captain Belmore. She periodically checked her email, expecting to hear something, an acknowledgement, a request for more information, anything. Late one afternoon, her phone buzzed. It was from the airline's internal investigations department. They requested a more in-depth interview regarding the flight. Their tone was apologetic, explaining that Danielle's report had triggered an official inquiry and that they would appreciate her cooperation. Danielle agreed, and a conference call was scheduled for the next morning. On the conference call, Danielle spoke with a panel of airline representatives and an FAA official who oversaw compliance. They asked her to recount the events in detail, from the pilot questioning her boarding pass to the final confrontation in the jet bridge. They also asked if she had reason to believe the pilot's actions were racially motivated. Danielle was careful with her words. She stated that while she couldn't read the pilot's mind, his repeated questioning of her right to be in first class, along with his dismissive attitude, strongly suggested bias. She also mentioned his refusal to take her safety concerns seriously, which put everyone at risk. The airline representatives sounded genuinely disturbed. The FAA official indicated that ignoring a potential safety issue due to personal bias was a grave violation of FAA guidelines. By the end of the call, Danielle felt a wave of relief, sensing they understood the seriousness of the situation. A week passed without further updates. Danielle immersed herself in her usual routine, traveling to different states for consultations. She visited a manufacturing plant in Texas, where new composite materials for airplane wings were being tested. She attended a symposium in Atlanta, where she gave a keynote on advanced flight safety. One evening, while she was in her hotel room, she received an email marked high importance from the airline's HR department. The subject line read, "Outcome of investigation, Captain Richard Belmore." Her heart pounded as she opened it. The email explained that the internal investigation had found Captain Belmore in violation of multiple airline policies, including professional conduct and safety protocol adherence. The FAA, having reviewed Danielle's report and the statements from flight attendants and maintenance staff, concluded he had shown reckless disregard for standard safety checks and engaged in discriminatory behavior. The airline had decided to ground Captain Belmore, effectively suspending him from flying pending further mandatory retraining and psychological evaluation. Additional disciplinary actions were being considered, and there was a strong possibility his pilot's license could be revoked or suspended by the FAA if he didn't comply with remedial steps. In short, Captain Belmore's career was in jeopardy because he had allowed his prejudice to override his professionalism and had neglected safety measures. Danielle let out a slow exhale as she read through the message. She felt no glee, just a profound sense of relief that justice was being served. Part of her empathized with anyone who lost their career, but accountability was necessary in a role that held so many lives in its hands. News of Captain Belmore's suspension spread swiftly through Delta Airlines and the broader aviation community, seeping into pilot break rooms, flight attendant group chats, and even private Facebook groups, where crew members often commiserated about their work. Initially, the airline tried to keep the investigation's details under wraps, but gossip travels quickly in tight-knit circles of professionals who spend countless hours together in the sky. Soon, people were whispering about how an FAA consultant had stepped in to prevent a potential safety hazard and, in the process, grounded a tenured pilot's career. Pilots who had flown with Captain Belmore in the past traded stories. Some described him as competent but occasionally arrogant. Others recalled minor run-ins when he refused to deviate from his routine, even if it meant risking unneeded turbulence or ignoring input from less experienced co-pilots. Flight attendants discussed their own run-ins with him, moments of condescension when they raised concerns about passenger comfort or unusual cabin noises. As these anecdotes poured in, many found themselves realizing that the seeds of this conflict had been planted long before Danielle Howard ever stepped onto that fateful flight. Danielle's name emerged as the driving force behind the inquiry. Although she had never intended to become a household name among Delta's staff, her role as a consultant and the gravity of the investigation meant everyone was trying to piece together the puzzle. Some employees sent her discreet messages of support, applauding her courage for filing a report that took aim at one of the airline's most senior captains. Others were more guarded, worried about possibly jeopardizing their own positions if they openly sided against someone with as many hours in the cockpit as Captain Belmore. A few old guard pilots who valued hierarchy above all else bristled at the notion that an outsider, and a black woman at that, could wield so much influence over a pilot's fate. Beyond the internal chatter, members of the press who covered airline news caught wind of the story, though only in fragments. Aviation forums buzzed with speculation about the electrical problem on that flight and whether the pilot's alleged bias had really led him to ignore a serious malfunction. One popular forum thread debated Danielle's credentials, with some praising her impressive background in aeronautical engineering and others complaining that safety consultants made too many waves by imposing strict regulations. Amid all this, Delta's corporate leadership tried to address the fallout. Emails from higher-ups circulated, reminding employees of the airline's commitment to both safety and respect in the workplace. Additional diversity and inclusion training was slated for flight crews, and the airline emphasized the importance of listening to all legitimate concerns, regardless of who raised them. Though these measures felt like a positive step to many younger employees, some long-standing crew members grumbled that things were changing too fast. Danielle herself heard about the swirling rumors when a friend in airline management sent her a text message. "Your name is everywhere. Right now, hope you're holding up okay," it read. In truth, she found the attention both validating and exhausting. While her primary goal had always been to ensure safe flying conditions, the situation had evolved into a much larger conversation about discrimination, power dynamics in the cockpit, and the responsibility of crew members to protect passengers at all costs. One afternoon, as Danielle passed through Seattle Tacoma International Airport en route to a meeting with Boeing engineers, she decided to grab a quick lunch at an airport cafe. She had just settled into a small table with her tray when she felt a presence at her side. Looking up, she saw First Officer Amanda Klein, Captain Belmore's former co-pilot, standing there, trying to muster a polite smile. "Hi, Miss Howard," Amanda began, glancing around nervously before taking a seat across from her. "I wanted to say thank you for what you did. I know it probably wasn't easy." Danielle set down her cup of coffee. "I appreciate that," she said, studying Amanda's worried expression. "How are you holding up?" Amanda tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It's been strange. The inquiry panel asked me a lot of questions about that flight. I told them the truth that I'd noticed an electrical fluctuation, and when I brought it up, Captain Belmore brushed it aside." She sighed, letting her gaze drift to the bustling concourse. "I've had a few co-workers ask me if I was betraying him by speaking up, but I just keep telling them that my responsibility is to safety, not to any single person." Danielle nodded, her expression one of understanding and empathy. "You did the right thing, Amanda. I know it can be uncomfortable, especially when the pilot is someone senior. But your testimony mattered. It confirmed there was a real issue that needed to be addressed." Amanda's eyes glistened with relief. "I've only been with Delta for a few years, but I've seen how quickly complaints can be dismissed if they don't come from a senior pilot." Captain Belmore sometimes acted like he was untouchable. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more during the flight itself." Danielle reached out to squeeze Amanda's hand gently. "Don't apologize. You stood up when it counted. Your honesty helped bring this situation to light, and hopefully it'll make the airline safer. Amanda seemed to relax slightly, her shoulders lowering as if a weight had been lifted. "If you need any more statements or anything, just let me know." Danielle offered a grateful smile. "I appreciate that. The official investigation is mostly wrapped up, but I'll keep you posted." They spoke for a few more minutes about procedural changes. They hoped the airline would implement better lines of communication between pilots and co-pilots, more robust training that emphasized equal respect for all roles and backgrounds, and clearer protocols for reporting concerns. By the time Amanda left to catch her next flight assignment, Danielle felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ripple effects of Captain Belmore's suspension extended far beyond the fate of one man's career. It sparked tough conversations among airline employees about prejudice, power imbalances, and the necessity of treating every single concern, regardless of the source, with gravity. And while not everyone welcomed those changes, enough voices were speaking up to ensure that something profound would shift in the culture. For Danielle, that shift was the best possible outcome. Though she hadn't set out to become a catalyst for sweeping change, she found solace in knowing that her actions might prevent future tragedies and encourage professionals like Amanda to keep championing safety over complacency. Although Danielle had never been one to seek revenge, her experience with Captain Belmore sparked a deeper sense of responsibility within her. She felt a renewed conviction that accountability in aviation was not just a procedural requirement, but a moral imperative. With Belmore's suspension making waves across the industry, she saw a window of opportunity to influence broader changes, ones that transcended a single pilot's fate. In the weeks following the investigation, Danielle was tapped by her superiors at the Federal Aviation Administration to lead a new task force specifically aimed at preventing scenarios where personal biases could hinder critical safety measures. The team's primary focus was to create protocols that empowered everyone from flight attendants to co-pilots, and even concerned passengers to report potential safety issues without fear of dismissal or retaliation. They reviewed airline policy manuals, analyzing how subtle cultural norms or outdated hierarchies might silence legitimate concerns. The scope of their work quickly expanded beyond Belmore's case. Danielle's task force reached out to airlines of all sizes, collecting data on reported incidents where prejudice or power imbalances might have impacted decision-making in the cockpit. In interviews, some flight attendants revealed they had been brushed off by captains for flagging weird smells or rattling sounds. Younger pilots recalled instances when senior captains refused to deviate from flight paths despite advanced weather warnings. One female co-pilot reported that her concerns were constantly overshadowed by a male pilot who believed he knew better. Each story reinforced Danielle's determination to build a more transparent, accountable reporting system. Simultaneously, Danielle collaborated with diversity training experts to develop mandatory workshops for flight crews. Part of the training involved simulated cockpit scenarios that tested how pilots and co-pilots responded to team input, especially if it came from someone they subconsciously perceived as less experienced or less authoritative. Role-play exercises highlighted how unconscious bias could lead to overlooking a critical warning sign. Some senior pilots resisted at first, grumbling about political correctness creeping into aviation. But as the training progressed, many came to see that heightened awareness of bias directly translated into better safety protocols and reduced risk. Outside the formal confines of the FAA, Danielle also engaged with pilot unions, encouraging them to integrate guidelines against discrimination into their member codes of conduct. She knew that true cultural change wouldn't come just from top-down regulation. It also needed grassroots acceptance and peer enforcement. Over time, small shifts in attitudes began to take root. Pilots began discussing near-miss incidents with more candor, and flight attendants reported feeling more emboldened to speak up without fear of career repercussions. For Danielle, these measures weren't just about rectifying one troubling flight. They were about building an industry culture where no seat assignment, no racial prejudice, and no personal grudge could overshadow the singular priority of passenger safety. From that day forward, she carried the memory of Captain Belmore's belittling remarks as a reminder of what could happen when unchecked bias mixed with professional arrogance. That memory fueled her personal mission to ensure that nobody passenger, flight attendant, or co-pilot would ever again be dismissed or demeaned for raising a legitimate concern, regardless of rank, gender, or background. Little by little, Danielle's vision began to manifest as tangible change, new policies, updated training modules, and a growing willingness among aviation professionals to look critically at their own blind spots. To Danielle, it was proof that even a painful encounter could pave the way for progress. And though there was still much work to do, she found satisfaction in knowing that her confrontation at 35,000 feet had served as a catalyst for reshaping an industry she cherished deeply. Weeks turned into months. Danielle occasionally wondered if Captain Belmore would reach out or if he'd simply fade into obscurity. Then, on a brisk autumn morning, she received a letter in the mail. The return address was from a small town in Ohio. Inside, she found a handwritten note on lined paper. It was from Richard Belmore. The handwriting was neat, each letter carefully formed as though he'd deliberated over every word. He began by explaining he had been grounded for 6 months, undergoing mandated counseling and retraining. He wrote that he had spent a great deal of time reflecting on his actions and realized his prejudice had blinded him to real safety concerns. He admitted he'd felt threatened by a young black woman in a position of authority and took his frustration out on her. He apologized sincerely for the distress he'd caused and for jeopardizing safety. He ended the letter by expressing a desire to meet in person one day if she was willing to offer a face-to-face apology. Danielle read it twice. She set it aside, feeling a complex swirl of emotions, anger, relief, empathy. In time, she might meet with him, but for now, she was content knowing he had faced his wrongdoing and was working to change. Karmic justice had been served, and with it, perhaps the seeds of redemption planted. For Danielle, this was never about destroying a man's career. It was about protecting the integrity of aviation, where no one black, white, or otherwise should ever be belittled, nor should legitimate concerns be dismissed. In the end, a single flight changed both their lives forever. She believed in the possibility of growth, so long as accountability and truth paved the way. Thank you for joining me on this journey filled with tension, resolution, and a powerful lesson on the dangers of unchecked bias. Danielle's story reminds us that a single moment of prejudice can trigger life-altering consequences, but also that courage in the face of injustice can protect countless others. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, inspired by Danielle's determination to stand up for what's right, I encourage you to share this story with your friends and family. Let's spread the word that respect, accountability, and equality are non-negotiable in our world. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of justice and redemption, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we can create a community that values truth, courage, and positive change. Thank you for watching,